After 10 years in my home, my daughter-in-law won $50 million, and that same evening said, "Get out of our house. We don't need you anymore." My son threw my things out the door. I smiled. "Dear, did you check whose name is on the ticket?" Good day, dear listeners. It's Larissa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Hargrove, though most people who love me have always called me Peggy. I turned 68 the March before everything happened, and I celebrated that birthday the same way I'd celebrated the previous 10. In my own kitchen, with the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls filling the house I'd lived in for 31 years. The house my late husband Roy and I had bought when Derek was just 13, when the yard still had that old oak tree he used to climb. The house where I'd buried a marriage, raised a son, and outlasted more winters than I cared to count. When Roy passed, 9 years ago now, pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral, Derek came to me with what he called a practical suggestion. He and Crystal had been renting an apartment on the east side of Columbus, and money was tight. "Mom," he said, sitting across from me at this very kitchen table, "it doesn't make sense for you to be rattling around in that big house alone. We could move in, help with the bills, keep you company." He had his father's eyes, and his father's way of making a selfish idea sound like a gift. I said yes. I said yes because I was 61 years old, and the silence in that house at night was the loudest thing I had ever heard. For the first 3 years, it was tolerable. Crystal kept to herself, which I told myself was just her personality. She was a quiet woman, controlled. With a tight smile she deployed like a tool rather than an expression. She worked in medical billing and was meticulous about money in the way that people are when they've grown up without it. She clipped coupons, tracked every grocery receipt, and once pointed out to me, with perfect pleasantness, that I'd been leaving lights on in the hallway, in my own hallway, in my own house. But the changes came slowly, the way rot comes to wood, invisible until the floor gives way beneath you. By year 5, Crystal had repainted the living room without asking me. A gray I didn't choose, cold as a parking garage. By year 7, she'd replaced my kitchen curtains, yellow gingham I'd hung the year Derek started high school, with something white and stiff that let in no warmth. Small things, I told myself. Adjustments. The instinct of a woman nesting in a space that wasn't hers. But then, there were the whispers. I am not a woman who eavesdrops. I want to be clear about that. But when you've lived in a house for 3 decades, you know every creak and echo in its walls. I was coming down the stairs one evening in November, the November before it all unraveled, when I heard Crystal's voice from the kitchen, low and deliberate. "She's not going to live forever, Derek. And when she's gone, this house is ours anyway." A pause. Then my son's voice, quieter, something I couldn't fully make out. And then Crystal again. "I'm just saying, we've been patient." I stood on the 4th step from the bottom and did not move for a long time. I told myself it meant nothing. People say things in kitchens at night that they don't really mean. I told myself that Crystal was practical, not cruel, and that Derek loved me. I told myself all the things a mother tells herself when she is not yet ready to know the truth. And then came the Saturday in February. Crystal had started buying lottery tickets the previous year, a habit she'd picked up from a woman at her office, she said. She bought them every week at the gas station on Route 40. 2 Powerball tickets, Always the same numbers. I knew this because she kept them tucked in the ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter, next to the mail. I knew this because it was my house, and I knew where everything was kept. That Saturday, I was in my bedroom reading when I heard a sound I had never heard from Crystal before. A sound like a scream swallowed into something else. Disbelief becoming euphoria, becoming something almost animal. Then footsteps, fast. Then Derek's voice rising. And then both of them together, loud. Louder than I'd heard them in 10 years. $50 million! I came to the kitchen doorway and stood there looking at them. Crystal holding her phone with shaking hands, Derek gripping her shoulders, both of them luminous with a kind of joy I had not seen on their faces in years. They didn't look at me for a long time. When Crystal finally did, something moved across her face. Something I recognized but did not name. Not then. It was that same evening. Not the next day, not after sleep and reflection, but that very evening, while the glow was still on them, that Crystal turned to me with the careful smile I knew so well and said words I will never forget. Peggy. She hadn't called me by name in months, usually avoided calling me anything at all. I think it's time we talked about the future. This is our house now. We're going to make some changes, and honestly, it would be better for everyone if you found your own place. Derek stood beside her. He did not look at me. You've been so generous letting us stay, Crystal continued, as though the story had already been rewritten, as though the deed in the county recorder's office said something different than it did. But we need space. You understand. I looked at my son. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the floor. By 9 o'clock that night, Derek had carried 2 of my suitcases to the front porch. He did it without speaking, without looking at my face. I stood in the doorway of my own home in the February cold, and I smiled. Sweetheart, I said, looking at Crystal, my voice so steady it surprised even me. Did you check whose name is on that ticket? She blinked, and then I picked up my purse and walked to my car. I drove to the Holiday Inn on Morse Road and paid for a room with my credit card and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the lights. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and recycled air. Through the window, the parking lot lights made everything orange and flat. I had 2 suitcases, my purse, my medications in their Tuesday through Sunday organizer, and 31 years of my life behind me in a house I still owned. Let me be precise about that last part, because it is the part that mattered most. I still owned the house. My name, Margaret Louise Hargrove, was on the deed, had been on the deed since 1993, and had never been removed. When Derek moved in, we hadn't done anything formal. No lease, no agreement, no transfer of any kind. I had not been sentimental about legal documents during my grief. That had been a mistake. But I had also never signed anything over. The house was mine, the way the October light through those yellow curtains had been mine, completely. I sat with that knowledge and let it settle. Then I thought about the lottery ticket. Here is what Crystal did not know, because she had never thought to ask. For the previous 8 months, I had been the one buying the Powerball tickets. It had started last June, when Crystal caught a stomach bug and asked me pleasantly, which should have felt like progress, to stop at the gas station on Route 40 and pick up her 2 usual tickets. She gave me a $20 bill and her usual numbers on a sticky note. I did it without a second thought. Then, the following week, she was running late for work and asked again. And the week after that, she simply handed me the sticky note on Friday evening without a word, and I understood that this had become my errand. The way taking out the recycling had become my errand, and picking up Derek's dry cleaning and calling the furnace repair company. I had become, in increments so gradual I'd barely noticed, the household manager of a home I legally owned, but from which I was slowly being erased. I bought the tickets, every week, at the BP station on Route 40, where the clerk was a young man named Jerome who knew me by now and always asked about my garden. I paid cash, tucked the tickets in my coat pocket, and brought them home to the ceramic bowl. I did not think about this arrangement. I did not examine it. But here's the thing about habits and oversight. I always paid with my own cash because I usually didn't have exact change from the 20, and I didn't ask Crystal to sort it out. And the tickets, every single one of them for 8 consecutive months, were printed with the name on the loyalty account I'd accidentally registered them under that first time in June. My name. The Columbus Lottery Commission's preferred customer card I'd applied for years ago as a joke when they first started the program, and had never canceled. My name on every stub, my phone number, my account. I sat in that orange hotel light and thought about this carefully. I am not a woman who has ever wanted to be vindictive. Roy used to say I was the most even-tempered person he'd ever met, that I could process an injustice and set it down like a heavy bag I'd decided not to carry anymore. But that night, I understood that there is a difference between letting go of bitterness and allowing yourself to be erased, between grace and surrender. Crystal had looked me in the eyes, in my own kitchen, in my own home, and told me to leave. Derek had carried my bags to the porch. They had not waited for morning. They had not offered me another room or time to call someone, or even the most basic human courtesy of a conversation. They had won $50 million, and within hours had decided that I was now inconvenient. The fear was there. I won't pretend otherwise. I was 68 years old, sitting alone in a hotel room with no plan and 2 suitcases. My knees ached. My heart was beating in a way that felt unfamiliar. I was aware, in the particular way, that older women alone in rooms become aware of things, of how fragile my position looked from the outside. But fear, I have learned, is only dangerous when you mistake it for information about the future. It is not. It is information about the present. And the present, I was beginning to understand, was entirely workable. I opened my purse and took out my address book, a real one, paper, the kind no one keeps anymore, and found the number for Martin Schell. Martin had been Roy's attorney for 20 years and had handled the estate after his death. He was in his late 70s now, semi-retired, but his son Paul had taken over the practice, and Martin had mentioned at Roy's memorial that Paul was sharper than he'd ever been. I looked at the clock. 11:42 p.m. Too late to call? I set my address book on the nightstand, lay back on the hotel bedspread still in my coat, and made myself think clearly. By midnight, I had the outline of a plan, not a vindictive one, a precise one. First, verify the ticket situation with documentation. Second, establish legal ownership of the house, quietly, without alerting Derek and Crystal. Third, contact the Ohio Lottery Commission to understand the claims process. Fourth, speak to Paul Schell in the morning. I turned off the light. For the first time since standing on that porch in the February cold, I slept. Paul Schell had his father's directness and none of his father's sentimentality, which was exactly what I needed. I called at 8:15 the next morning from a corner table at the Panera 2 blocks from the hotel, with a coffee I hadn't tasted and a notepad I'd bought at the CVS across the street. When I explained the situation, calmly, in sequence, From the lottery card registration in June to the eviction the night before. Paul was quiet for a moment and then said, "Mrs. Hargrove, I need you to come in this morning." His office was on the 4th floor of a building on North High Street, clean and plain the way working law offices are clean and plain, not the performative mahogany of the kind that charges you for the furniture. His assistant brought me water. Paul sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and asked me to start from the beginning. I told him everything: the ticket routine, my loyalty account, the ceramic bowl, the conversation on the porch, Derek's silence as he carried my bags out. Paul wrote without looking up. Then he set his pen down and folded his hands. "The Ohio Lottery Preferred Player account. Do you still have access?" "I have the app on my phone," I said. "Open it." I did. There, under my tickets, was the entry from Saturday evening. Powerball. 8 numbers. Matched. The ticket was flagged with a green banner I had never seen before. Prize pending claim. Estimated value, $50 million. My name, my account, my phone number on the confirmation. Paul looked at it for a long moment. "The ticket was purchased with your account and your registered payment preference. Crystal played the numbers, but the registered purchaser of record is you." He paused. "That is not a minor detail." "I understand that now," I said. "Have you made any statements to Crystal or Derek about the ticket? Anything that could be construed as a transfer of ownership or an acknowledgement of her claim?" I thought about what I'd said on the porch. "Did you check whose name is on that ticket?" That was all. They hadn't answered. They hadn't even understood what I meant. Crystal had blinked and I had walked to my car. "Nothing," I said. "I asked a question, that was all." Paul nodded slowly. "Good. We need to move quickly, but we need to move carefully. I'm going to call the Ohio Lottery Commission today and put a notification on file regarding the registered account holder's intent to claim. That's a protective step. It doesn't prevent their claim yet, but it creates a record. We also need to talk about the house. The house," he confirmed, "was entirely mine. The deed had never been altered. Derek and Crystal's 10-year residence, without any formal lease or tenancy agreement, created what Ohio law recognized as a tenancy at will, which meant they had residency rights. But I had grounds to begin formal proceedings to reclaim possession. He advised a formal written notice, hand-delivered or certified mail, within the week. "This is going to get complicated," Paul said. "You understand that." "I understand. Derek is your son." "I understand that too." He looked at me for a moment. "All right, Mrs. Hargrove. Let's get to work." I left his office at 10:30 with a folder of preliminary documents, a copy of the deed he'd pulled from county records, and a kind of steadiness in my chest that felt different from calm. It felt like purpose. What I did not know, walking to my car on North High Street, was that Crystal had already begun to move. I learned this later, pieced together from what other people told me and from what eventually came out in the formal proceedings. Apparently, on Sunday morning, while I was sitting in Panera calling Paul, Crystal had driven to the BP station on Route 40 to speak with Jerome, the clerk. She wanted confirmation of the purchase. Jerome, who knew me and did not know Crystal, told her the tickets on that account were always purchased by the older lady, the one with the garden. He'd said it helpfully, without understanding what it meant. Crystal had come home and told Derek. By Sunday afternoon, they were calling around. They called a lawyer, a friend of Derek's from his years in sales, a man named Gary Pittman, who handled mostly contract disputes and had never touched lottery law in his life. Gary apparently told them that registered account ownership was a complication, but that Crystal's long-standing use of the numbers and her consistent payment of the entry fees might constitute a viable claim. He used the phrase equitable interest, which is a real legal concept and which Gary Pittman apparently understood just well enough to be dangerous. They did not call me. What they did instead, and I found this out Tuesday, when my neighbor Linda called to ask if everything was all right, was that Derek had gone to Linda's house and told her that I'd had some kind of episode, that I wasn't well, that I'd become confused and left the house in an agitated state, and they were worried about me. He'd done this with two of my neighbors. I sat in my hotel room that Tuesday evening and felt something I had not allowed myself to feel since the porch. A cold, clean anger. They weren't just fighting the ticket. They were building a narrative, diminished capacity, confusion, an old woman who didn't understand what was happening. I called Paul immediately. "They're trying to establish that I'm incompetent," I said. "Yes," he said, without surprise. "Which is why tomorrow morning, before anything else, you're going to your doctor and getting a full cognitive assessment on record." He paused. "And Peggy? You need to stop staying in a hotel. That looks like instability. Is there someone you can stay with?" There was. My sister Carol lived 20 minutes away in Westerville, in the house she'd shared with her husband before he retired to Florida, and she'd decided she liked Ohio winters more than she liked him. She was 72, formidable, and when I called her that night and told her everything, she was silent for exactly 4 seconds. "Come tomorrow," she said, "and bring the folder." Carol met me at the door of her house in Westerville with a pot of coffee already made and the particular expression she'd been wearing since childhood whenever someone had done something that required dealing with. I moved into her guest room on a Wednesday. By Friday, Paul had filed the formal lottery claim on my behalf with the Ohio Lottery Commission, citing registered account ownership and my documentation as the consistent purchasing agent on record. The commission, per their process, immediately placed a hold on the prize disbursement pending review. $50 million sitting still. Paul had also drafted and sent, via certified mail, a formal notice of tenancy termination to Derek and Crystal at the Granville Road address. It was not an eviction notice yet. Ohio law requires specific procedures and timelines. But it was the first official document that told them, in the language of the courts, that the tenancy at will was being addressed. Both documents landed on the same day. I know this because Derek called me Thursday evening, before the certified letter had even arrived, which meant someone had told him about the lottery hold. Perhaps Gary Pittman had contacts at the commission. Perhaps Crystal had called to check on the claim status and been informed. Either way, my phone lit up at 7:15 with Derek's name on the screen. I answered, "Mom." His voice was a temperature I recognized, the controlled warmth he used when he needed something. "Mom, we need to talk. There's been some kind of mix-up with the lottery account, and I think it's just a clerical issue." "It's not a clerical issue, Derek." Silence. "You need to talk to my attorney," I said. "His name is Paul Schell. I'll give you the number." "Mom, stop. Just stop. You don't need a lawyer. This is family." "When family puts my suitcases on the porch," I said, "it becomes something else." He shifted. The warmth dropped out of his voice like a thermostat cut off. "You're making a mistake. You don't understand what you're doing. You've never dealt with anything like this, and you're going to get hurt. Gary says you don't have any real claim." "Then Gary can explain that to Paul in writing." I ended the call. I sat at Carol's kitchen table afterward, and my hands were completely still, which surprised me. I had expected to shake. The certified letter arrived the next morning. By that afternoon, Crystal had called my cell 4 times. I did not answer. She then called Carol's landline. I did not know how she had that number. And when Carol picked up, Crystal's voice came through the receiver loud enough that I could hear it across the kitchen. "She's confused," Crystal said. "She's been confused for months. You need to get her to a doctor. She's going to throw away $50 million because she's lost her grip on reality. Carol's response was 3 words, delivered with the same pleasant tone she used to order coffee. Speak to her attorney. Then she hung up. The cognitive assessment had already been done, as it happened. I had gone to Dr. Anita Ferreira, my physician for 16 years, on Thursday morning, and she had administered the standard evaluation and noted in the official record that I was fully oriented, with no signs of cognitive impairment. Paul had a copy. The narrative they were building was already collapsing, but they had one more move before they retreated. On Saturday afternoon, a car I didn't recognize pulled up in front of Carol's house. Derek got out, and with him was a man I'd never seen. Late 40s, gray suit, briefcase that looked too new. Gary Pittman, I assumed, or someone Gary had brought in. They knocked. Carol opened the door. She's not available. We'd like 5 minutes, Derek said. She's not available. Carol, please. I stepped into the doorway behind my sister. Derek looked at me for a moment. His face had changed since the night on the porch. Less certain, something cracked in the confidence. Mom, please. Just hear what we have to say. You can file a counterclaim with the Lottery Commission if you believe you have grounds, I said. That's the process. The man in the gray suit spoke. Mrs. Hargrove, we believe there's a genuine misunderstanding here that could be resolved without litigation. Crystal has played these numbers for 3 years. The intent of the purchase was always— I know what the intent was, I said. File with the commission. Gray suit kept his voice smooth. If this goes to a formal dispute, it's going to be public. The press covers lottery disputes. Your name, your age, your family situation, all of that becomes part of the record. Do you really want that? There it was. The threat dressed as concern. I looked at him for a long moment. I'm 68 years old, I said. I have lived in this state for 40 years. I have no criminal record, no debt, and a cognitive evaluation that was completed 48 hours ago. I welcome the press. They left 20 minutes later without having come inside. Carol closed the door and turned to me. Her face was something between proud and furious. Good Lord, Peggy. I know, I said. That night, for the first time since the hotel room, I let myself feel the exhaustion underneath everything. Not the fear. The simple biological tiredness of a woman who had been managing a crisis in her body and her mind for a solid week without rest. I called Paul and told him I needed a few days before the next step. Take them, he said immediately. The hold is in place. Nothing moves without your involvement. Rest. I spent the next 3 days at Carol's, mostly in the backyard in the March cold, wrapped in Roy's old flannel blanket, drinking tea and watching the bare trees. Carol made soup. She didn't ask me questions I didn't want to answer. She understood, the way sisters understand, that some recoveries are done in silence. On the 4th day, I was ready. The offer came via email, which told me everything about where they were. In my experience, people who are confident make phone calls. People who want a record or who are afraid of the conversation write it down. Derek's email arrived on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the night on the porch. The subject line read, "A proposal. Please read." I read it at Carol's kitchen table while my sister pretended to be absorbed in the newspaper. The email was long and carefully written. I recognized Crystal's hand in the phrasing. Derek had never been precise with language, but this was meticulous. The argument they made was essentially this. They acknowledged that there was a technical issue with the account registration, but they believed the intent of the weekly purchase had always been for Crystal's benefit. They were not, they wrote, unreasonable people. They understood that I had been hurt by the way the conversation on February 14th had gone. They actually used that word, conversation. For the evening, my son carried my luggage to the porch, and they wanted to make things right. Their proposal: they would share 20% of the net prize with me. After federal and state taxes, the lump sum would be approximately $26 million. 20% would be roughly $5 million. $5 million. To walk away. I read the email twice. Then I closed my phone and picked up my tea. Carol put down the newspaper. Well, they've offered me $5 million to drop the claim. She was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of money. It's my money, I said. She nodded once and went back to the newspaper. I want to be honest about this moment because I think dishonesty here would make the rest of the story seem simpler than it was. $5 million is not nothing. I am 68 years old. I live on a pension and Social Security and a small amount Roy left in savings. And I have never in my life had more than $80,000 in a bank account at one time. The number was large enough that I felt it physically. A kind of vertigo, like standing at the edge of something. But I kept returning to one image. Derek, not looking at my face, carrying my suitcases to the porch, not in anger, not in a moment of shock or poor judgment. Deliberately, and in silence. I forwarded the email to Paul and wrote 3 words. Not interested. Proceed, Paul called an hour later. I expected this. They're feeling the pressure from the commission hold. I want to schedule the formal interview with the lottery investigator for next week, if you're ready. I'm ready, I said. What happened next surprised me because I had not anticipated it. Linda, my neighbor from Granville Road, called on Wednesday. She had heard from another neighbor from the usual channels of a residential street that there was some kind of dispute, and she wanted me to know that she had told Derek when he'd come to her door with his story about my episode, that she had known me for 22 years and she had never once seen me confused about anything. I told him, Linda said, that you were the most organized person I knew and that the only people I'd ever seen acting strangely around that house were the 2 of them. I thanked her with more feeling than I'd shown anyone in 2 weeks. Then my pastor, Reverend Thomas Hayes at Westerville Community Church, called to say he'd heard I was going through something difficult and that the congregation was praying for me. This was the church I'd attended since 1998, the church where Roy's funeral had been held. Reverend Hayes had known me long enough to not ask questions I wasn't ready to answer, which was its own kind of grace. And then, this one caught me off guard, Jerome called. Jerome from the BP station on Route 40. He'd gotten my number from the preferred player account, which he'd accessed when Crystal had come to ask him about the tickets. He said he didn't know if it was his place to say anything, but that he'd already told the lottery investigator what he told Crystal, that the tickets on that account were always purchased by me, every week, for at least 8 months, and that he had never once seen Crystal at the counter. I figured you should know, he said. In case it helps? It helps very much, I said. Thank you, Jerome. I sat in Carol's guest room that evening and thought about the strange, quiet architecture of a life. The pastor and the neighbor and the gas station clerk, none of them had been recruited. None of them had been asked. They had simply witnessed, and then they had spoken. That, I thought, is what 20 years of living decently looks like when you finally need it. Crystal and Derek had gone quiet after the email. They were watching, Paul told me, monitoring the commission process, consulting with Gary Pittman, probably running a financial calculation about the cost of a protracted legal fight versus another offer. Let them watch. I was not in a hurry. I was also not going to move. They came on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the email, which I think was deliberate. Weekends feel softer than weekdays. People's defenses are lower when the work week is behind them. Carol called me from the kitchen at 10 in the morning. Derek's car just pulled up. I was in the guest room, halfway through my second cup of coffee. I set it down, took a breath, and made a decision about how I was going to be in the next hour. calm, present, not unkind, but not permeable. I came to the living room and sat in Carol's armchair, not on the sofa, which would have put me side by side with them. The armchair faced the room. It was, I realized, the right choice. Carol brought them in. Derek was wearing a sweater I'd given him for Christmas 3 years ago. I noticed this and said nothing about it. Crystal wore her hair down, which she almost never did. Another calculation, I thought. Softer, less severe. She was carrying, of all things, a small potted orchid. "For you," she said, setting it on the coffee table. "Thank you," I said. There was a moment of uncomfortable rearranging as they settled on the sofa. Carol went to the kitchen, which I knew she would not actually stay in. The house was small enough that she could hear everything from behind the wall. Derek started. He started with his childhood. He started with Roy's memory, which was, I noted with the cold part of my mind, the cruelest place to begin. He talked about growing up in the Granville Roadhouse, about what it had meant to him, about how much he'd wanted to take care of me after his father died. He said he was sorry for the way things had happened on February 14th. He said it had been a bad night, and that Crystal had been overwhelmed, and that things had gotten out of hand. He did not say, "I was wrong to carry your bags to the porch." He did not say, "I should not have stood there while my wife told you to leave." He described the event as something that had happened around him rather than something he had done. I listened without expression. Then Crystal spoke. She had rehearsed this too. I could feel the structure of it, the beats placed with a billing specialist's precision. She said she'd never intended for me to feel unwelcome. She said she'd been under tremendous stress. She said that she and Derek had been talking, and they realized they wanted me to come home. Home. She used that word. "We're family," she said. "And the lottery, we think we can work something out that feels fair to everyone. Something more than what we offered in the email. We want you to be comfortable." I looked at her. "How much?" She blinked slightly. I think she'd expected me to soften, to tear up, to reach toward the orchid as a sign. "We were thinking, 10 million. That's a genuine share, Peggy. That's life-changing money." "The ticket is in my name," I said. "We know that. We're not saying it isn't." Her voice was careful now, the pleasantness slightly strained. "But there are other ways of looking at this. Crystal played those numbers for 3 years before I started buying the tickets," I said. "It was an informal arrangement," Derek said. "Mom, come on. You know you were buying them for her. You never once thought they were yours." "Derek," I said, "I have a loyalty account in my name, 8 months of purchase records in my name, a witness at the point of sale, and a prize notification sent to my registered phone number." I paused. What I thought privately doesn't change what the documentation says. The temperature in the room changed. Crystal set down her coffee cup with a small, deliberate click. "You know what I think? I think you're doing this out of spite. I think you've always resented me in that house, and this is your way of punishing Derek." "Crystal," Derek said, a warning in his voice, but directed at her or at me, I couldn't tell. "She's 68 years old," Crystal continued, and her voice had found a new register now, flat and tight. "She has no idea what it takes to go to court. The fees alone." "My legal fees are covered," I said, which was not entirely true, but was directionally accurate enough. "We will fight this," Crystal said. "We will tie it up for years. You'll be in your 70s before you see a dime. And the press, when people find out an old woman is suing her son for a lottery ticket." "When the press finds out," I said, "they'll also find out about the cognitive assessment, the purchase records, and the night my bags were left on the porch. I looked at her steadily. Which version of that story do you think plays better? Crystal stood up. She did not take the orchid. Derek stood too. For a moment, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a teenager. Something young and frightened under the adult surface. I felt a pull in my chest that I will not pretend wasn't there. He was still my son. He was still Roy's son, but he had stood beside her on the porch. And he had not called me once to ask if I was all right. "Goodbye, Derek," I said. They left without speaking. I sat in Carol's armchair after the car pulled away and felt something move through me that I did not enjoy. Not regret. Not exactly. Something more like grief. The kind you feel when something is confirmed that you'd been hoping was wrong. I had hoped, somewhere small and foolish, that when he looked at me in that living room, he might choose differently. He hadn't. I pressed my hands flat on my knees and breathed until the feeling passed. And when it passed, what was underneath it was not sadness, but resolution. A kind of mineral hardness that I recognized as the thing that would carry me through whatever was left to do. Carol came in from the kitchen. She said nothing. She just put her hand on my shoulder for a moment, briefly. That was enough. The Ohio Lottery Commission's prize dispute review is not a courtroom. It takes place in a conference room in a government building on Front Street in Columbus. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a long table with a pitcher of water nobody touches. There is an investigator, a hearing officer, and, in cases of this size, a commission attorney. I arrived 7 minutes early, which is my habit. Paul Schell sat beside me. I wore the gray wool blazer I'd bought for Roy's retirement dinner 12 years ago because it was the most serious piece of clothing I owned. Derek and Crystal arrived 2 minutes before the scheduled time. They were with Gary Pittman, who was smaller in person than I'd imagined, and a second attorney. A woman I didn't recognize who carried herself like someone billing $400 an hour. An upgrade, I noted. The $50 million was making them more serious about their case. The hearing officer, a woman named Ms. Okafor, explained the process with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done it many times. Each party would present their claim. Documentation would be entered into the record. The investigator would ask questions. A determination would follow in writing within 30 business days. Paul went first. He presented, in sequence, the preferred player account registration in my name, dated June of the prior year. The purchase history: 32 consecutive weekly transactions, all on the registered account, all attributed to the same point-of-sale terminal at the BP station on Route 40. Jerome's written statement, which had been submitted in advance. Dr. Ferreira's cognitive assessment, dated 10 days after the eviction. The deed to the Granville Road property, demonstrating that I was the homeowner and Crystal and Derek were residents at my invitation. He presented the email offer, the 20% offer, as evidence that the opposing party had tacitly acknowledged the legitimacy of my claim. The $400 attorney objected to that characterization. Ms. Okafor noted the objection and moved on. Then it was Crystal's turn. She had a binder. She had printed the numbers she'd been playing. The same 6 numbers for 3 years, with receipts from the period before I took over the purchasing. She had a written statement from Derek confirming that the weekly lottery purchase had always been her tradition, and that I had been helping out with an errand. The investigator, a methodical man named Mr. Baptiste, asked Crystal a series of questions. Ms. Hargrove, Crystal Hargrove, between June of last year and February of this year, how many times did you personally purchase a lottery ticket at the BP station on Route 40? Crystal paused. It varied. Some weeks I asked Peggy to go. Some weeks, Mr. Baptiste repeated. The purchase records for that terminal show 32 consecutive transactions on the registered account during that period, all between a Thursday and Saturday, all attributed to the same customer loyalty number. Were you present for any of those transactions? Another pause. Longer. I may not have been present for all of them. Were you present for any of them? Gary Pittman leaned in and said something to Crystal. She straightened. I believe there were some weeks where I went myself. There's no record of a separate account or cash purchase for those numbers during that period, Mr. Baptiste said pleasantly. The $400 attorney spoke up about cash transactions being untraceable. Mr. Baptiste said he understood that and asked Crystal to describe the physical appearance of the BP station on Route 40. Crystal described it. The description was not wrong, exactly, but it was generic in a way that suggested she was recalling something she'd been told rather than something she'd seen. The color of the counter, the layout of the displays. She said the clerk was a young man, which was accurate, but she could not recall his name. Mr. Baptiste made a note. Then came the question I had not anticipated, and which Paul told me afterward was the one that closed the matter. Mr. Baptiste looked at Crystal and asked, on the evening of February 14th, after you and your husband discovered the potential winning ticket, did you ask Margaret Hargrove to leave the property at Granville Road? Crystal's attorney touched her arm. Crystal said, we had a conversation about, did you ask her to leave? We discussed the living arrangement. Ms. Hargrove, Mr. Baptiste's voice was still perfectly even. If you had believed, on the evening of February 14th, that the prize ticket was registered in Margaret Hargrove's name, would you have asked her to leave? The room was quiet. It was the simplest question in the room, and it had only one honest answer, and Crystal knew it. I watched her face cycle through several expressions in the space of about 4 seconds. Calculation, frustration, and then, briefly, something that looked almost like the truth. She said nothing. Gary Pittman said, my client doesn't need to speculate. She doesn't, Ms. Okafor agreed. Let the record note the question was posed and not answered. I did not look at Derek during any of this. I had decided before arriving that I would not. But at this moment I felt, rather than saw, his stillness on the other side of the table. The specific stillness of a person who understands that the thing they built has collapsed and that they are sitting in the rubble of it. Paul touched my wrist once lightly under the table. I kept my hands still and my expression neutral, and I drank the water I'd told myself I wouldn't touch. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. When it ended and we walked out into the thin March sunlight on Front Street, Paul said, 30 days for the written determination, but, Peggy, I've been doing this for 22 years. I know what that room sounded like. I nodded. I drove back to Carroll's alone because I needed the drive. The fields along a 270 were still brown with winter, flat and honest under a gray sky. I thought about Roy. I thought about the yellow curtains. I thought about Jerome at the BP counter, pulling up the records with the careful attention of someone who understood that truth is sometimes stored in small, mechanical things. A transaction timestamp, a customer number, a name. I thought about what I had spent the last month becoming. Not harder, exactly. More exact. More clear about what was mine and what it meant to protect it. I turned onto Carroll Street and parked and sat in the car for a moment. Then I went inside. The letter came on a Tuesday, 26 days after the hearing. Paul called me at 8 a.m. to say it had arrived at his office and asked if I wanted him to read it to me over the phone or if I wanted to come in. Read it, I said. I was standing in Carol's kitchen in my bathrobe, and I did not sit down. Paul read the relevant section in the flat, clean voice of a man delivering a document rather than a verdict. The Ohio Lottery Commission, following its prize dispute review process, had determined that the winning Powerball ticket purchased on February 11th was registered to the preferred player account of Margaret Louise Hargrove. The account had been established in her name, the purchase was made on her account, and the prize notification had been issued to her registered contact information. In the absence of any written agreement, witnessed transfer of purchase authority, or documentation establishing beneficial ownership in another party's name, the Commission awarded the full prize to the registered account holder. Full prize. Not 20%, not 10. Full. The net lump sum, after federal and state taxes, came to approximately $26.3 million. I stood in Carol's kitchen and said nothing for a moment. "Peggy," Paul said. "I'm here," I said. "What happens next?" What happened next was a series of steps I moved through, with Paul's guidance, over the following 2 weeks. I elected the lump sum. I retained a wealth management firm Paul recommended, an independent firm in Columbus with a 40-year track record and no flashy branding, which Roy had always said was the best sign in a financial advisor. I opened new accounts in my name only. The funds were deposited on a Wednesday morning, and Paul sent me a confirmation email, and I sat in Carol's guest room and looked at the number on my phone screen for a long time. Then there was the house. Paul had filed the formal tenancy termination proceedings in tandem with the lottery dispute, and with the commission determination now on record, establishing that Crystal and Derek had, in effect, attempted to claim assets belonging to the legal homeowner and then tried to remove her from her own property. The court moved with unusual efficiency. Derek and Crystal received a formal order of possession notice. They had 30 days to vacate. Derek called me twice during that 30 days. I answered the second call. His voice was different from any version of it I'd heard before. Not the controlled warmth, not the anger from the porch conversation, not the studied conciliation of Carol's living room. It was simply tired. "Mom," he said, "where are we supposed to go?" I had thought about this. I had thought about it carefully, and I had thought about Roy, and I had thought about the oak tree and the Christmas sweater, and the specific way Derek had looked at the floor on the night of February 14th. "That's not my responsibility to solve," I said. "But I do want you to know. If you had called me the day after, if you had called and said you were sorry and that you'd been wrong, I would have found a way to make it work. That's the truth." He was quiet for a moment. "Crystal said," "I know what Crystal said," I told him. "You made your choice." I ended the call, not in anger, but in the way you close a door when you've said everything there is to say. Crystal and Derek vacated the house in the last week of April. I know because Linda called to tell me the moving truck had come and gone in a single day, which told her they hadn't accumulated much that was actually theirs. The gray paint, it turned out, was not a color that could be taken anywhere. I had a contractor come in during the first week of May. I had the living room repainted, a warm cream close to the original color I'd chosen with Roy. I had new curtains made for the kitchen, not yellow gingham. Those were gone, and I was not someone who recreates the past when the present is available, but a warm ivory linen that let the morning light in soft and even. I walked through every room of that house on the first morning back with my coffee in my bathrobe, alone. It smelled like fresh paint and May and 31 years of living. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard where the old oak was long gone but the stump remained, and I thought, this is mine. This has always been mine. Then I sat down at the table and started making a list of everything I wanted to do next. I did not do anything dramatic with the money. I already knew what I wanted my life to look like, and at 68, a shopping montage was not it. The first thing I did was sit down with a financial planner and make sure I would never need to rely on anyone else for the rest of my life. That took about an hour and felt like the deepest breath I'd taken in years. The second thing I did was fix the roof. Roy had known it needed work since 2018, and we'd deferred it, and then he'd gotten sick, and it had been on my list for 5 years. I called a contractor and had it done in 2 weeks. The morning after it was finished, I stood in the yard in the rain just to watch the water run clean off the gutters. Then I did the kitchen properly. Butcher block countertop, better lighting, new appliances. I had the yard regraded so it didn't flood along the fence line the way it had since 1999. Small, practical things that made the house better and gave me, each time one was finished, a satisfaction that only comes from taking care of something you love. I set up a scholarship fund at the community college, 2 scholarships a year for returning adult women students. I donated to the church restoration fund. Reverend Hayes cried on the phone, which I found embarrassing and also lovely. Linda came for dinner in June, and we sat on the porch until 10 in the evening. I started sleeping 8 hours without waking at 3 a.m., with that familiar arithmetic of worry. As for Derek and Crystal, they had moved into an apartment in Reynoldsburg. The legal fees had cost them considerably. Gary Pittman and the $400 attorney did not come cheap, and they had borrowed against expectations that never materialized. Derek had started a small landscaping business. Crystal had left her job. I heard they had debt and that they argued often. I did not feel triumph when I heard this. What I felt was sadness. The same grief I'd felt in Carol's armchair. The confirmation of something I'd hoped was wrong. I called Derek on his birthday in November. He answered. I said happy birthday. He said thank you. And then, Mom, I'm sorry. 3 words, and I understood they cost him something. I know, I said. We talked for 11 minutes. It was not a reconciliation. It was 2 people who had hurt each other, being decent to each other for 11 minutes. Sometimes that is what family looks like. Sometimes that is enough. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table in the house I had always owned, with the butcher block countertop and the ivory curtains and October wind in the trees. And I thought, I did not lose everything. I did not even lose myself. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything. Here is what I learned. Documentation is not distrust. It is dignity. Know what is yours. Write it down. Never let anyone quietly erase the record of what you built. And when someone moves the curtains in your home without asking, pay attention. That is never just about curtains. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story stayed with you, please subscribe. Thank you for being here.